Next, we're going to move on to Zane Sloan and Sarah Gaib. Zane Sloan is a civil engineer with Arcadis-IBI group. Most of his career has been focused on road infrastructure planning, design, and construction. In 2014, Zane began refocusing his career toward the challenges of adaptation to climate change. Sarah is a geotechnical engineer with the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. Most of her career has been focused on geotechnical work associated with road infrastructure, including foundations, slope stability, and landslide design. Sarah's current role is engineering director for the Cariboo Road Recovery Projects. So thank you very much, Zane and Sarah, and we'll pass it over to you.
All right, I have too many slides, so I'm going to go pretty fast. So next slide. Just wanted to show you the heart of the machine here in British Columbia. And in a heart, there's 4 chambers, and what we see here on the right side are 4 cells here. Basically, PIEVC came up with the protocol right back in 2000, started in 2005, but I'm starting the story around 2006, about 17 years ago. That's when the ministry really started getting engaged in this realm. And by 2010 to 2014, that first box you see in the flow chart, that's when they undertook the PIEVC protocols. Then the second part of the chamber, they got the best practices guidance. And then the next part of the chamber, they got the technical circular, the technical standards and policies established. And then knowing the high risk items that we have here in province, that's when we're getting to more detailed climate risk assessments. And that's that bottom part of the flow chart. Next slide, please. Just wanted to point out how this aligns with the flow chart from the climate lens from Infrastructure Canada. First step, get your vulnerabilities figured out. And then you figure out your medium and high risk items, you get into detailed climate risk assessments. And of course, the end product is here to select and implement relevant resilience measures. And that's where we're all headed. Next slide, please. So this is just to show the 5 PIEVC protocol assessments that the province undertook between 2010 to 2014 and encompasses a range of climatological conditions in British Columbia. Next slide, please. They grouped infrastructure into many categories, almost 100 or so, but in the end, they came to the conclusion that there are 14 categories at high risk in the province, and 5 climate hazard events are largely responsible for these high risk things happening. Next slide, please. Of course, once they figured out what was high risk, that's when they developed these best practices. Next slide, please. This is the policy, the technical circular. That was important basically to tell engineers, if you design infrastructure for the province, you got to take climate change into account. Next slide, please. Now, 2020, 2021, we get a bunch of landslides in the middle of the province. This is the Cariboo Road Recovery Project. Next slide, please. It's located here in the province in the middle, right in between all of those other PIEVC protocols that were done previously. Next slide, please. But then, of course, as everyone is aware, that the November flood disaster happened here. And I'll even read off some of the things that were discovered that were at high risk, such as, and you can see them all destroyed here, embankment cuts, hillsides, debris torrents, structures that cross streams, that's your bridges, river training works, pretty much anything in the water, culverts, asphalt spillways, in-stream habitat works, off-channel habitat works, and of course, what was the culprit? Precipitation events, extreme hazard events, and that's what was theorized during the PIEVC protocols and now confirmed here as the disasters really started to hit British Columbia. Next slide, please. Enter stage left, the PIEVC high-level screening guide. So this came out in February 2022, and we realized we can use this tool for a detailed climate risk assessment, looking more closely at these 14 categories at high risk. Next slide, please. So what do? We take that PIEVC high-level screening guide spreadsheet, we pre-populated it with these 5 climate hazards and these elements that we know that are already at high risk. And we want to give this pre-populated spreadsheet to the design team so that they can start to populate it with the actual infrastructure they're currently designing that fall under these categories that are at high risk. And I got a gold bar on the right side where I say, this is the gold. This is really what we're after here. We want to have these conversations with the design team about these high risk elements, considering these climate hazard events to figure out, is there still anything at high risk in their design as they're currently designing it? Next slide, please. So this is the first project we undertook. It was for the Kersley Dale Landing Road project. And what you see here is the alignment of the road alongside the Fraser River. We can see in this air photo the difference between forested areas and where the drainage arrows go. Those polygons are the drainage catchments that we needed to consider along the way. Next slide, please. We also, of course, had the design plans to go along with it, profiles, cross sections, and plan views. Next slide, please. This is what the end product, after we undertook workshops with design teams, this is what it looks like from a distance, right? And what did it pull out? What did it identify? It identified what's at low risk, medium risk, and where there is still anything at high risk. Next slide, please. Now, how did we come to this conclusion? Well, we looked at those 5 climate events, such as maximum 1-day precipitation, maximum 5-day precipitation, the river flows, then the snow melt. But we added 3 more, and we called them affected slopes. This was to take into consideration for compounding and sequential events, such as scorched earth or mountain pine beetle or land use changes, logging roads, rain on snow melt events, and things like that to expand our consideration of risks. Next slide, please. All right, and of course we had to assign our likelihood scores, and that's what Jeff alluded to in his presentation there, talking about the middle baseline method. And what we were looking for here was the trend. So I was working with Jeff O'Driscoll on this actually, and he and I went to climatedata.ca, took a look at the trends for these, maximum 1-day precipitation, maximum 5-day precipitation, and we saw the trends going up. We had a meeting with Pacific Climate Impact Consortium to get a better idea too of climate trends in this area. And we didn't have, so we assigned our likelihood scores, typically 3, 4, 5, middle baseline method, using a 3 for present day, 4 for the 2050s, and 5 for the 2080s, because that's where the trend was going. We did not have data when it came to river flows. So we assumed, well, we're looking for risks. So let's assume that is also increasing, the trend is going up. So you can see we indicate that as a dash for the present day, then a plus for the 2050s, and a plus for the 2080s, indicating an upward trend. And that was our assumption, trying to uncover the actual risks. Next slide, please. This is from the Kersley Dale Landing Road project. Out of those 14 categories at high risk that were identified during the protocols, this project only actually had 5 of the categories at high risk in their project. So that's the embankment cuts and constructed and existing, hillsides existing. Then we got our culverts there, less than 3 meters. We had a number of culverts to consider. Emergency responses, and of course the road subbase we considered as well. Next slide, please. So that was where we got together in a workshop using a bit of a middle baseline method approach as well to assign the consequence scores. And really this was the whole thing. The whole workshop really just focused on these consequence scores, and of course the discussion that went along with it, which we recorded with a diligent scribe who was recording the consequences and the discussions along the way. Next slide, please. Here's what we found. I'm circling here from our spreadsheet what came out as a high risk element that still existed. Here you can see the cross section on the left side there where we got a 2.85 to 1 cut slope, which is a pretty flat cut slope. But we're talking about an area here that has now experienced a lot of interesting precipitation events after long drought events, and the ground turned a bit to mush, and we have problems here. And we came to realize that the analysis here could be deeper. Let's go to the next slide, actually. And this was the discussion we recorded that really got, and we recorded all this conversation and even had some design considerations and actions for the designers to consider. And that's where all this was recorded in the spreadsheet there. It's all documented, one-stop shopping. So the designers can then see what we considered in this workshop and also maybe some suggestions to work on along the way. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm kind of out of time. I'm going to pass this over to Sarah Gaib. So what's happening now is we've handed this spreadsheet off to the designers for them to consider. Now the project has taken some twisted and turns since then, but that's where we're headed now, is to actually compensate and mitigate those risks that we identified during the workshops. So over to Sarah to talk about what we're doing next.
Thanks, Zane. And so I'm just going to speak to the assessment that was done and any gaps or opportunities for improvement that we feel can be applied to the assessment. So next slide, please. Yeah, so just looking at those 5 hazard parameters and as well as the elements at risks, I think Jeff had called those the asset categories. So there's 5 and 14 of them. Just looking specifically at the Cariboo site, there needs to be consideration for additional parameters there. So in the case of the Cariboo, we saw that there was a lot of movement associated with a long duration of rain, and that's not reflected in the parameters that just those 5 that have been highlighted. And similarly, looking at the elements at risk, they need to be specific to the site. So just an evaluation, I think Zane ran through that of the 14 that have been shortlisted, 5 applied to this one. And we have examples of other projects where 14 may not be comprehensive enough and we need to add to it. So just really looking at the site specific needs and whether those parameters are sufficient. Similarly, just looking at the risk assessment itself, we want something that's going to be very repeatable and transparent and can be applied much more broadly. And each practitioner who does the work, it's done in a very consistent manner. So looking at the work that was done, the consequence, it's very, I guess, vague. It has limited guidance in terms of what that means. And from one project team to the next, the interpretation of that may be different. So the ministry has, different examples of how we've done this for other prioritization work, such as our rockfall hazard rating system or how we do seismic retrofit. And so what we tend to look at is consideration for the road classification, whether it's a primary highway or a low volume road. We consider the operational impact, if it's a couple hours to clean up material, if it's, a closure that's days, weeks, months. When we had the November atmospheric river events, we saw that the closure of 1 month on the Coquihalla was pretty catastrophic. And then consideration if the road itself is just a single access to a community, and that if it is closed, it would be cut off. So the ministry is working through further defining what those different scoring levels will mean from a very low impact to a very high. Next slide, please. And similarly, both Zane and Jeff have talked about the probability. So we're looking at the trend, is it getting wetter? Is it getting hotter? The approach that was taken here for the Kersley Dale, so I've copied over the Kersley Dale numbers, and just looking in that first column, the 1 day rainfall went from 23 mils to 25 to 29. And Zane's correct, the trend, it continues to go up. And so it was scored 3, 4, 5. And that's very conservative. Jeff had what he had shown in his slide was looking at a percentage increase. And his slide spoke to, 50%, 100%. So the ministry is looking at putting bounds on what those scoring guidelines would be. And so that will just help as well for consistency on that end. And that's it for my presentation.